Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And this is the sort of week where I can predict there's going to be absolutely no controversy whatsoever. Oh, yeah, right. This is On the Pulse. Got 6 albums on the docket this week, starting off with, from Mura Masa, R.Y.C.
Come back to me at night and try as though I might to live for now.
So I remember being kind of conflicted on Eric Crossan's self-titled project in 2017 under the name Mura Masa, a hodgepodge of potentially great instrumental ideas, grooves, and an overloaded roster of big-name guest stars, hamstrung by a lack of solid flow and some truly obnoxious Chainsmokers-esque lyrics. And yet it made complete sense that he'd be going in more of a stripped-back, acoustic rock direction on this album. Crossan has had some roots in punk, and maybe a more emo framework would help the content stick the landing a little bit deeper. And when you tack on the fractured auto-tune and all the stuttering drum machines, it is clear this is landing in a similar ballpark to Brockhampton or Glass Beach, and I think closer to the cluster of sleeker electronics that he once used. Kind of ironic, as the Chainsmokers have been also attempting this same sort of pivot, and they've failed miserably. And you know what? This is a lot better as a result. The grooves are still well defined, but they've got a little bit more homegrown organic texture, which reinforces the very adolescent framing and introspection. An album that gets in its own head and then thoroughly stays there, with only a few fractured moments of real release. Now, unfortunately, while this does cultivate a pretty decent, melancholic, wistful, emo vibe that you can even dance to, this also translates to an album that kind of meanders and can feel short on momentum for its relatively brief runtime, and also short on hooks. And while the relationship songs are better framed, we have heard the sort of sputtering, underwritten bedroom awkwardness plenty of times before, and I'd struggle to say that the writing truly cuts or rise above the obvious influences. Yes, Slow Thigh is a cantankerous blast of energy that's very welcome, and following it with the Dancing With Myself riff on Vicarious Living Anthem, that was welcome, but it's also a song that feels imported from a different and possibly more interesting album. And that's not counting how the album's centerpiece, in my mind, it's a track that I'm fairly certain Patricia Taxon has already made and made better about a year ago. Now, all that being said, this is a pivot for Mura Masa that has some promise and seems to have better taste in the style than I expected. Georgia, she sounds better here than on many of the songs from her own album last week, and Ellie Rosell of Wolf Alice, it's an inspired pick. So, yeah, you know what? I'm erring on the side of positive. Light 7 out of 10. Check this out. Next, from Bombay Bicycle Club, Everything Else Has Gone Wrong.
Come and see you tonight.
You hear a lot of critics get really angry at the commodification of indie rock these days, but I got a theory it's partially their own damn fault. Who else would have given this lukewarm pass to thoroughly milquetoast and mediocre indie acts who got just enough cred to mass market their trend chasing and their increasingly anonymous pablum, with the delusion that a good guitar rollick can overcompensate for having no personality or unique charisma anywhere else, especially in the vocals and writing. And we want a particularly shameless example of this, Bombay Bicycle Club, who spent most of the 2010s trend hopping and going into a pop-adjacent adult alternative sound before going on hiatus. And look, the most common defense for Bombay Bicycle Club is, even by most of the fans, is that for as derivative and lightweight as they are, they're ultimately kind of harmless. They can make some catchy tunes that might stick in your head, that's fine. And in this case, a slightly brighter sense of elbow-esque commercial-ready flash that's time-locked in 2014, that might not be bad, right? Well, there's 3 major problems with that. Number 1, the gated and stuttering percussion doesn't work to blend any sense of groove, and opposite John Congleton's production and the gurgling, over-processed synth and guitar blend, it feels really awkwardly blocky where it should be breezy. Number 2, Jack Steadman still has no distinctive personality as a singer or a writer, and his attempts to ramp up a crescendo feel clunky as all hell. And number 3, most exasperatingly, it's an album that's trying to translate its writer's block and undercooked relationship songs into compelling drama, and then winds up in the fetal position, especially in the face of awareness of real-world issues where they're being referenced to sound timely, but never seriously digging into them, because this band is privileged to the point where they don't really have to, but they want to appropriate the urgency for their framing. It's the same myopia that seriously tainted Vampire Weekend's last release and pretty much the entire career of AJR, and yet while there's a sort of audience for this gutless but blissful escapism, no, I can't stomach this. Pull the else out of your album titled Bombay Bicycle Club. That might have been a bit more honest. 4 to 10, avoid it. Next up from Hayley Mary, The Piss, The Perfume. Now isn't this convenient? Right after I'm covering Bombay Bicycle Club, I'm discussing an act that was going down a similar parallel arc to them, and yet somehow wound up consistently better? And by that, I'm of course talking about the Jezebels, the Australian indie rock group fronted by Hayley Mary that took a similar massive, blurry, post-punk sound on their debut before softening towards 80s pop on future releases. The only difference is that this band embraced a lot of bigness and actual hooks that played for Mary's fondness of Kate Bush. The first album, Prisoner, it was really an underappreciated gem. The second still had a lot of the same DNA, but felt a lot more glossy and smooth. I'm gonna blame the producer for most of that, because they went back to their original producer for the third album, Cynthia, in 2016, and while the pop elements were still there, the raw grounding texture was back, and that made the world a difference. That was a great album too. Now Hayley Mary has released a solo EP of material, and well, the writing is still sharp, and I like the delivery and the scuzzy texture, but if you're hunting for that sense of bigness that made the Jezebels so compelling, this EP might feel less impressive or unique within modern indie rock or power pop than you're expecting. Now, it's still solid. Mary delivers a lot of throaty personality, there's a crisp brightness to the guitar work that's enjoyable, the grooves have a lot of punch, and while that sense of frustrated but well-contextualized yearning can feel a little threadbare, cuts like the title track, Brat, and especially Holly, they are pretty great. But yeah, this sort of power pop is kind of dime a dozen in the indie scene, but I can recognize that it's pretty damn fun all the same. I like this, good stuff. 7 out of 10. Check it out if you're curious. Pretty short, so it's worth it. Next up, from Algiers, There Is No Year. Don't wanna know the joy it brings again. Ah yes, the first project of the year I was really anticipating and really excited about. Algiers have delivered some of the most potent, genre-bending music of the last decade, and hooking up with Randall Dunn on production seemed like the sort of surefire slam dunk that would set things right, and, you know, I've wanted to praise this to high heaven since I first heard it, and I was convinced that the shift in sound would place for some greater dividends once I became accustomed to it, but it's only kind of completely clicked in isolated parts, and I don't think it's just one person's fault here either. Randall Dunn might have been responsible for lowering so many of the bass grooves so they're nowhere near as sinuous or thick, but he didn't choose to pick up at so many blocky programmed drum machines, an utterly baffling decision when you have Matt Tong at your disposal, and when you have a band that can get as anthemic as Algiers does. Stripping things back for a more spare, ominous, paranoid exercise in introspection and deconstruction can be fascinating conceptually, but is it playing to their strengths when the guitars and the synths don't pick up as much thunderous presence? And honestly, what's kind of exasperating is that on a thematic level, this project is as robust and solid as ever, with all the lyrics drawn from a poem called Misophonia by the frontman Franklin James Fisher. It's an album that drills into the deconstructive, anxious nightmare of seeing your artistic and political identity buckle and warp inwards when faced with the crushing reality of how much you can really change in a spiraling world, especially when racial discourse isn't infused into a lot of the conversation. It's not so much nihilistic, but a lot of gallows humor and seeing this collapse impact everyone, but more so yourself, and then desperate to find some sort of core to claw out of this void. It's also the reason why Algiers' usual blunt language is so subtly devastating, universal to so many, but the slogans can start to ring hollow in the chill emptiness and isolation that comes with that helplessness against an implacable system. It's why a lot of these tones being used here can feel so off-kilter and frail at points. It matches that atmosphere. As such, There Is No Year is not the album to save you so much as a dive into a doom-adjacent existential nightmare that only gets better the deeper you tread until the band burns their way out, but the seething intensity of previous albums feels a little bit guttered here, and while that was intentional, I'm not sure it captures the same deeper emotional resonance. Still, you know what, for what they're doing, and the fact that Algiers still brings a base level of uniqueness and excellence, I think this is still pretty great. Solid 8 out of 10, absolutely check this out. Still pretty special. Next up, from Halsey, Manic. So about 2 years ago, I made the hot take on Twitter that Halsey would flame out with her next album and that paradoxically would be her most interesting music to date. I didn't expect to be as close to being correct as I think I am, because the popular buzz and rollout for this album has been kinda haphazard even before getting overshadowed by, well, the last project we'll be covering here. But I'd like to correct the implication that I wanted this to happen by making that take, instead of it just being a frustrated observation about the limited lifespan of your average pop star struggling to know herself. And that's the thing about Manic, it's not a bad album by any stretch. Hell, I'd probably call it her best. But if it wasn't for Without Me being dropped in the middle of it, which is comfortably the worst song on the album too, I should add, it'd have the searching feel of a genre-twisting indie pop experiment searching for identity and clarity instead of a selection of bona fide surefire hits, which makes it a lot more interesting for me, but also a lot less marketable. Now granted, that doesn't mean that there aren't issues here. The vocal mixing is really messy and inconsistent from song to song and doesn't do much to accentuate the richer instrumental melody outside of some of the bare keys, and when Halsey still doesn't have the emotive intensity or charisma of her more expressive pop peers like Lorde or Aurora or even Gabby Hanna, that's still an issue, especially when she has to go on Twitter later and describe emotions she was trying to convey on the album that don't come through in her performance. And the album's arc's a lot more tenuous and scattered, both thematically and in how it throws itself across different genres with a lot of mixed results. You can reference Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, but from 2014 Sold Out by Jhené Aiko is nothing to worry about here. I'd argue a major factor is how much her producers, her co-writers, and even her guest stars leave such an imprint that can actually overshadow hers. The tropical cadence that's unmistakable on Still Learning, it screams of Ed Sheeran, which is frustrating for a cut that's all about self-love, and both Alanis Morissette and Suga from BTS kind of take over their interludes. But it actually runs deeper. For as much as Halsey ends the album honestly just wanting to search and wanting to break free of writing about relationships, they all still cast long shadows. And Halsey still strip mines a lot of that material for a lot of pathos, which still reflects a certain artificiality to all her vulnerability that she's putting forward, and that gets distracting. That being said though, as much as Halsey doesn't really impress me as a performer, and she badly just needs to work with one producer that can help her find a consistent sound, with cuts like 3 AM and 929, and especially More, there is a more defined, grounded honesty to her as a writer that's better framed. And if this is our first real glimpse of Ashley, yeah, you know what? I'm curious to hear more. This was good. 6 out of 10. Check it out if you're curious. And finally, from Eminem, Music to be Murdered to. You know, I said on Twitter that even as a longtime Eminem fan, I would have been comfortable with Joe Budden ending M's career at any time now. And then I heard Joe Budden's podcast, where you can tell he's still a little bothered by some of the passing jibes, but in essence, he's moved on. Hell, it's M who has been stewing in bitterness and frustration at the haters as the flows will get faster and less coherent. The filler bars and the horrible punchlines, they already make this hour-plus album full of clunky drums, auto-tune concessions to modernity, and inconsistent vocal mastering a real chore, and songs like Marsh are absolutely that. But it's the change in ideology and subtext that just kills any replay value for me. It's got the feeling of watching a politically insightful comedian right after a social media backlash, rightful or not, where the majority of the jokes in the set are just an extended rant on that backlash, and when they're not, because that's where his mind is, the jokes just kind of suck. I think there'll be some overlap between the audience that gets off on that and this Eminem album, but what's so disappointing is that M used to hold up a mirror to that audience and seriously challenge that perspective, not give them, and by extension himself, a pass. And it's a single darkness that actually really proved it for me, spoken from the interweaving perspective of a man who shoots up a concert and someone who's overdosing on pills and alcohol, that same sort of performer, but where in the past it was often a point surrounding artistic suicide, here M says we can't know the rationale of those mass shooters, those who will self-destruct and hurt others. Except we do. We've seen manifestos. More than ever, the ideologies are understood. And he knows that we know this, because if there's an artist who's explored white male psychopathy more, it's Eminem. So where the hell does that white privilege reversal on Leaving Heaven come from? And how did R.Y.C let you get away with that, given his verse on You Gonna Learn? Where's the self-awareness? Where's the deeper deconstruction? Where's any sort of deeper personal storytelling beyond self-indulgent fantasies like Stepdad? The hookup jams that were cringy even when M was in his prime. Someone please tell him to stop working with Ed Sheeran, my god. But where even the most tolerable moments are facsimiles of songs that M has made before. Never Love Again? It's 25 to life, but swapping out hip-hop for drugs. Stepdad is a revenge fantasy that was more visceral and insane and more impactful in his first verse to Sing for the Moment. And I swear he's retold that same bad relationship song on In Too Deep and Farewell dozens of times now. What frustrates me the most is that Eminem is often the most distracting part of his own songs, where on Godzilla with Juice WRLD he'll spiral off beat into a ream of blisteringly fast filler and bad lines, or the weird penchant for dad joke punchlines that he'll then explain and then destroy any sense of darker atmosphere, or that then will flash this ugly no apologies defensiveness that is not only monumentally insecure, it's also wildly hypocritical, because embracing the victim complex while framing himself as the winner, it's the worst sort of direction for him. I mean, why else did you assemble every member of Slaughterhouse except Joe Budden on I Will, and then fill your verse with Lord Jamar shots and dead baby jokes, and then still miss Joe's overall point about bad business by not giving Griselda the time of day to elevate them on your label, especially after their last year? They could have loved that push. But at the end of the day, again, like so many guys my age, Eminem was one of my first introductions to rap music and hip-hop culture. I think the big difference now is that I've moved on from that time and that limited perspective, and he really hasn't. Which for a rap nerd like him, me watching, it's incredibly disappointing. Especially when his tentative steps to modernize, they feel so clumsy and awkward, where those that he's inspired are now kind of passing him by. And you know what, that's his lane now. He's always gonna have that crew of white guy stans who will miss the point of that song and ride or die in that lane, but I'm taking the exit out. Especially when it feels like such an artistic regression across the board. This music ain't killing me or killing for me. I just really wish it could. Very late 4 out of 10. It's only for the stands now. They probably won't get that joke. But yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I know I kind of went off long on this one, but yeah, some of these really hurt. Some of these really sucked. Couple good surprises, but hey, if you're curious about those albums, leave the comments down there below. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. And if you want to put albums on my schedule for me to be covering in the weeks ahead, links to my Patreon is right over there, where all the rules are described in detail. Beyond that, I'm Mark. You're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse. And I'll see you next time.